October 15th, 1944, approximately 80 miles northwest of Formosa, in the waters that would soon become known as a graveyard for Japanese naval aviation. Flight Petty Officer First Class Kiyoshi Nakamura tightened his grip on the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M5 Zero fighter, the latest variant of Japan's once legendary interceptor. Through the morning haze, he could see them, a formation of American fighters flying protective cover over a carrier task force. From this distance, they looked like any other Grumman fighters he had encountered, but within minutes, Nakamura would discover something that would fundamentally alter his understanding of aerial combat, something that would shatter the tactics Japanese pilots had perfected over 3 years of war. The aircraft he was about to engage was the F6F Hellcat, and what he was about to learn would save his life that day, even as it sealed the fate of hundreds of his comrades. The armor plate behind the pilot's seat, the bulletproof windscreen, the self-sealing fuel tanks. These were not just engineering features, they were the physical manifestation of a new American philosophy of air combat, one that valued pilot survival over aircraft performance, one that recognized a trained aviator was more valuable than any machine, and one that would prove utterly devastating to an enemy who had bet everything on maneuverability and firepower at the expense of protection. The transformation had not begun with this engagement. It had started 2 years earlier, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, when American engineers examined wreckage from downed Zeros and made a shocking discovery. The aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific skies for a year carried no armor whatsoever, no protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, nothing but thin aluminum skin between the aviator and incoming fire. This revelation would set in motion a design philosophy that culminated in the Hellcat, a fighter built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. December 7th, 1941. Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii. The morning after Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch walked among the wreckage of Japanese aircraft shot down during the attack. He was one of the Navy's most innovative tactical thinkers, already developing defensive maneuvers that would later bear his name. But on this morning, he was simply trying to understand the enemy. As he examined a relatively intact Zero that had crashed after being hit by anti-aircraft fire, something struck him as profoundly wrong. The cockpit area showed no signs of armor plating. The fuel tanks, ruptured by the crash, appeared to be nothing more than thin metal containers with no protective lining. The entire airframe seemed impossibly light, almost fragile. Thach ran his hand along the fuselage skin. It was thinner than American specifications would allow for a combat aircraft. This was a fighter designed for performance at any cost. The cost, Thatch realized with growing concern, was pilot survival. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Zero's design philosophy made tactical sense for Japan in 1941. The Imperial Navy needed a carrier-based fighter capable of escorting bombers on long-range missions deep into enemy territory. Range required fuel capacity. Fuel capacity meant weight. Weight was the enemy of performance. The solution was ruthless elimination of anything deemed non-essential. Armor protection was deemed non-essential. Self-sealing fuel tanks were deemed non-essential. The structural margins that American engineers built into every design were deemed non-essential. What remained was an aircraft of remarkable purity, a fighter that could fly over 1,900 miles, climb to altitude faster than anything America fielded in 1941, and turn inside any opponent in a dogfight. It was piloted by men who had spent years training for this moment, many of them veterans of combat operations in China since the late 1930s. The combination of superior aircraft performance and superior pilot skill had given Japan absolute air superiority in the opening year of the Pacific War. But the philosophy carried a hidden cost. Every hit that struck a Zero was potentially fatal. A single .50 caliber bullet through the fuel tank could ignite aviation gasoline instantly. A short burst into the engine could cause catastrophic failure with no redundancy to keep the aircraft flying. A round striking the cockpit area had nothing to slow it down before reaching the pilot. The Zero was designed to avoid being hit, not to survive being hit. This worked brilliantly as long as Japanese pilots maintained their skill and experience advantage. In early engagements against poorly trained Allied pilots flying inferior aircraft, the Zero's weaknesses rarely mattered. Japanese aviators won their fights through superior tactics and aircraft performance, destroying the enemy before incoming fire became a concern. But war is an evolutionary process. The side that learns faster survives. And America was learning. By mid-1942, American intelligence had compiled detailed reports on the Zero from multiple sources. Pilots who had survived encounters provided observations. Technical intelligence teams examined crashed aircraft. Most importantly, in June of 1942, an intact Zero was recovered from Akutan Island in the Aleutians, providing American engineers their first opportunity to thoroughly examine Japan's primary fighter. The testing of that captured Zero revealed precise technical data that confirmed what pilots had suspected. The aircraft carried no armor protection whatsoever. The pilot sat behind nothing more than sheet aluminum and the aircraft's control systems. The fuel tanks were standard, aluminum construction with no self-sealing capability. A tracer round or incendiary ammunition striking a fuel tank would almost certainly cause fire. Multiple detailed reports were compiled and distributed throughout the fleet. They influenced design decisions for America's next generation of naval fighters. Engineers at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, already deep into development of the F6F Hellcat, incorporated lessons learned from examining the Zero's vulnerabilities. The Americans would build a fighter that represented a fundamentally different design philosophy. Performance mattered, but so did protection. January through June, 1942. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, Long Island, New York. The design team working on what would become the F6F Hellcat faced a crucial decision about armor protection. Adding armor meant adding weight. Weight reduced performance. Every pound of armor plate was a pound that could have been additional fuel, ammunition, or simply eliminated to improve speed and climb rate. The Zero's success had proven that an unarmored fighter with superior performance could dominate the skies. Why not follow the same philosophy? Build the lightest, fastest, most maneuverable fighter possible and trust pilot skill to avoid enemy fire. Chief designer Bill Schwendler rejected this approach. He had studied the combat reports from the Pacific. He had seen the casualty figures. He understood what the Zero's lack of protection meant in practical terms. American pilots were dying not because they lost their dogfights, but because a single lucky hit could prove fatal even in an engagement they were winning. A pilot who had skillfully maneuvered onto a Zero's tail and was about to achieve a kill might take return fire from the Zero's rear-facing observer or from another Japanese fighter he had not seen. In an armored aircraft, those hits might be survivable. In an unarmored aircraft, they were often fatal. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Training a replacement pilot took months and consumed resources America could not afford to waste. Every pilot lost meant not just a casualty, but the loss of accumulated experience and combat knowledge. An aircraft could be replaced in weeks. A trained aviator could not. Therefore, the design philosophy for the Hellcat would prioritize pilot survival even at the cost of some performance. The armor protection suite designed into the F6F was comprehensive and carefully engineered. Behind the pilot's seat, a plate of face-hardened armor steel, approximately 3/8 of an inch thick, provided protection against fire from behind. This armor plate was angled and positioned to cover the pilot's back and head from rounds coming from the rear hemisphere. The steel chosen was not ordinary steel. It was hardened armor plate, heat-treated to provide maximum resistance to penetration while minimizing weight. The windscreen incorporated bulletproof glass, multiple layers of glass and plastic, laminated together to stop small arms fire and shell fragments while maintaining optical clarity. This protected the pilot from frontal attacks and debris. Additional armor plates protected critical engine components and the oil cooling system. Losing oil pressure meant engine failure, and engine failure over the Pacific Ocean meant death even if the pilot was uninjured. Protecting the systems that kept the engine running was as important as protecting the pilot directly. The fuel tanks incorporated self-sealing technology, a remarkable innovation that would prove as important as armor plate. Each fuel tank was lined with multiple layers of rubber compounds. When a bullet pierced the tank, aviation fuel would cause the rubber to swell, sealing the hole and preventing the fuel from spraying into the aircraft's interior or leaking overboard. This did not make the tanks invulnerable. A large enough hole or fire would still cause catastrophic failure. But it dramatically reduced the likelihood of fuel tank hits, causing immediate aircraft loss. The weight penalty for all this protection was substantial. The armor package alone added approximately 140 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight. The self-sealing fuel tanks added additional weight compared to standard tanks. The bulletproof windscreen was heavier than ordinary glass. In total, the protective features added several £100 to the Hellcat's weight, compared to what it would have weighed with no protection at all. But Grumman's engineers had an answer to the weight problem: power. The F6F was designed around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial power plant producing over 2,000 horsepower. This massive engine provided enough thrust to overcome the weight penalties of armor and protection while still delivering performance that met or exceeded the zero in most flight regimes except low-speed turning. The American philosophy was clear: build a fighter tough enough to bring the pilot home, make it fast enough to control when engagements occurred, give it firepower devastating enough to destroy fragile enemy aircraft with short bursts, and produce it in numbers that would overwhelm any opponent through sheer industrial might. This was not the philosophy of the Zero. It was the philosophy that would defeat the Zero. By the summer of 1943, F6F Hellcats were beginning to reach fleet squadrons. The first combat deployments occurred in August of that year, and pilots immediately noticed the difference. The aircraft felt solid in a way the F4F Wildcat never had. The cockpit was spacious, visibility was excellent, and there was a psychological comfort in knowing that armor plate stood between you and enemy fire. But the true test would come when Japanese pilots encountered this new American fighter in combat and discovered that their weapons, which had served them so well against earlier Allied aircraft, were suddenly far less effective. The tactics that had worked against Wildcats and other fighters no longer produced the same results. The short burst that would have sent an enemy fighter down in flames might now simply damage a Hellcat without killing it or forcing it to break off combat. October 15th, 1944. The air battle that Flight Petty Officer First Class Kiyoshi Nakamura was about to enter represented the culmination of 3 years of evolution in Pacific air combat. The Japanese formation, 12 Zero fighters from the carrier Zuikaku, had been ordered to attack American carrier forces operating off Formosa. These were not inexperienced pilots. Several, including Nakamura, had survived over a year of combat. They understood American tactics. They knew the thatch weave and boom and zoom attacks. They had adapted their own tactics to counter American advantages. But adaptation could only go so far when the fundamental balance of combat had shifted. The approaching Hellcat formation outnumbered the Zeros and held altitude advantage. Standard doctrine called for the Japanese pilots to use their superior maneuverability to force turning combat where the Zero's advantages might compensate for the Hellcat's speed and firepower. Nakamura's flight leader waggled his wings, the signal to prepare for engagement. The Japanese formation began to spread out, each pilot selecting a target and beginning the approach. Nakamura chose a Hellcat on the American formation's right flank, slightly separated from his wingman. This was the classic tactical opening. Isolate an enemy fighter, force him into a turning fight, and use the Zero's tighter turn radius to get on his tail. Nakamura nosed over into a shallow dive, building speed for the initial pass. The Hellcat pilot saw him coming. The American fighter turned toward him, accepting the head-on engagement. This was unusual. Early in the war, American pilots had avoided head-on passes with Zeros, respecting the Japanese fighters' 20mm cannons. But now they came straight in, confident in their aircraft's protection. The two fighters closed at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. Nakamura squeezed his trigger at approximately 800 yards. The Zero's two 20mm Type 99 cannons opened fire, their shells tracing toward the oncoming Hellcat. He could see his rounds striking the American fighter's nose and cowling. Definite hits. But the Hellcat did not waver. It came straight through his fire, its 650 caliber Browning machine guns opening up at closer range. Nakamura felt his aircraft shudder as American rounds struck his Zero. He broke hard left, using his fighter's superior roll rate at low speeds to evade. The Hellcat flashed past, continuing in a straight line rather than attempting to turn with him. This was standard American doctrine now. Do, not turn with a Zero. Use speed to disengage, reposition, and attack again from advantage. But Nakamura was focused on something else. He had scored solid hits on that Hellcat. He had seen his 20mm shells impact the aircraft's nose. Yet the American fighter had maintained its course, fired back, and pulled away under full power. The engine had not been knocked out, the aircraft had not shown signs of structural damage, the pilot had not broken off. How was this possible? The answer lay in the armor protection Grumman had engineered into the Hellcat. Nakamura's 20mm shells had struck the engine cowling and the armored engine components. The Zero's Type 99 cannon fired a shell that weighed approximately 4.4 ounces and had a muzzle velocity of about 2,000 feet per second. Against the thin aluminum skin of earlier Allied fighters, this had been devastatingly effective. A single hit could punch through an aircraft's structure and cause catastrophic damage. But the Hellcat's engine was protected by hardened steel plating over critical components. The cowling itself was reinforced. The 20mm shells that struck these protected areas either failed to penetrate or penetrated without reaching vital engine components. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was also inherently robust, with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. Damage to one or even several cylinders often did not prevent the engine from continuing to run, albeit at reduced power. Nakamura did not have time to process this information during the engagement. He was already looking for his next attack opportunity. The Hellcat had zoomed away, climbing back to altitude. 2 more American fighters were diving toward his position. He turned hard right, then reversed left, using the Zero's maneuverability to spoil their tracking solutions. The Hellcats did not attempt to follow his turns. They made one firing pass each, then climbed away. This pattern repeated throughout the engagement. Nakamura would maneuver into firing position and unleash his cannons at a Hellcat. He would see hits, sometimes multiple hits. Yet the American aircraft continued fighting. They did not explode. They did not trail smoke and dive away. They absorbed the damage and kept coming. It was profoundly demoralizing. The battle lasted approximately 12 minutes. In that time, the Japanese formation lost 5 aircraft confirmed destroyed. 3 pilots were killed. 2 managed to bail out and were later recovered by Japanese submarines. The American formation lost 1 Hellcat, the pilot rescued by a destroyer. The mathematics of attrition were unsustainable for Japan. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating. After the engagement, Nakamura and the surviving Zero pilots returned to their carrier. During the debriefing, multiple pilots reported the same observation. Their cannon fire was not producing the expected results. They were scoring hits, but American aircraft were not going down. The debriefing officer listened carefully and made detailed notes. This was not the first time such reports had reached headquarters. Over the previous months, similar accounts had come from across the Pacific theater. Japanese pilots were increasingly frustrated by their inability to quickly destroy American fighters even when they achieved firing positions. The obvious explanation was that they were missing, but experienced pilots insisted they were scoring hits, and the hits were simply not effective. The truth was difficult for Japanese commanders to accept. American aircraft were now protected in ways that Japanese fighters were not. The tactical implications were profound. Japanese doctrine had always emphasized achieving the first hit. Get your guns on target before the enemy could fire back, and the engagement was essentially over. A short burst from the Zero's 20mm cannons would send most Allied fighters down in flames, but against the Hellcat, the first hit no longer guaranteed victory. The American fighter could absorb multiple hits and remain combat effective. This meant Japanese pilots had to maintain fire for longer periods, requiring them to stay in firing position longer, which exposed them to return fire from the Hellcat's 650 caliber guns or from the American pilot's wingmen. The risk-reward calculation had shifted decisively against the Zero. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were facing an impossible situation. Their primary fighter, the Zero, was increasingly obsolete in several critical aspects. It lacked the speed to escape unfavorable engagements. It lacked the armor to survive incoming fire. Its weapons, while theoretically powerful enough to destroy any aircraft, were no longer delivering decisive results against American fighters in the brief firing opportunities combat provided, and Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce a replacement fighter in adequate numbers. Newer Japanese fighters like the Kawanishi N-1K Shiden and Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate offered better performance and some improved protection, but they remained scarce. The Zero continued as the standard Japanese naval fighter simply because nothing else was available in sufficient quantities. American intelligence was well aware of the Hellcat's protective capabilities and their impact on combat effectiveness. After-action reports consistently noted that Hellcats returned from missions with damage that would have destroyed earlier fighters. Battle damage assessment teams carefully documented every hit, cataloguing the location, type of weapon, and whether the protection had successfully defeated the round or allowed it to cause damage. The data compiled from these assessments validated the design decisions Grumman had made. Armor protection was working as intended. Pilots were surviving hits that would have killed them in unprotected aircraft. Self-sealing fuel tanks were preventing fires that would have destroyed aircraft. The weight penalty for protection was more than justified by the reduction in pilot casualties and aircraft losses. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. November 5th, 1944. Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego, California. Lieutenant Commander Edward Murphy stood before a damaged F6F Hellcat that had been shipped back from the Pacific for detailed analysis. The aircraft belonged to a pilot from VF-15, Lieutenant Carl Brown, who had survived an engagement with multiple Japanese fighters over the Philippines. The Hellcat's fuselage told the story of that survival. Murphy counted 17 separate impact points from Japanese weapons. Most were from 7.7mm machine gun fire, but at least 4 were clearly from 20mm cannon shells. He walked slowly around the aircraft, examining each hit. Several 20mm impacts had struck the engine cowling. The armor plating behind the cowling showed deep gouges where the shells had struck but failed to penetrate completely. The engine had continued running despite these hits. 2 20mm shells had struck the area behind the cockpit. One had hit the armored seat back directly, leaving a crater in the steel plate but not penetrating through to where the pilot sat. The other had struck at an angle, deflecting off the armor and exiting through the fuselage skin without reaching any critical structure. The pilot had felt the impacts, but had not been wounded. The bulletproof windscreen showed 3 impact points from small arms fire. The outer layers of glass were starred and cracked, but the rounds had not penetrated to the inner layer. The pilot's visibility had been degraded but not eliminated. He had been able to continue fighting and navigate back to his carrier. The self-sealing fuel tanks had been hit twice. Inspection of the tanks after the aircraft landed showed the self-sealing compound had worked exactly as designed. The bullet holes were surrounded by swelled rubber that had sealed the openings and prevented fuel loss. Murphy compiled his assessment. This aircraft had absorbed damage that would have destroyed a Zero or most other Japanese fighters. The pilot had not only survived, but had continued fighting after taking multiple hits. He had returned to his carrier, made a successful arrested landing, and suffered no injuries. The aircraft had been repaired and returned to service within 3 days. This was exactly what the protective features were designed to accomplish. The assessment was forwarded to the Bureau of Aeronautics and to Grumman for their records. Similar reports were flowing in from across the Pacific. The Hellcat's protective suite was proving its worth in combat after combat, but the most dramatic examples came from pilots who had been hit in circumstances that should have been fatal and walked away, uninjured. January 6, 1945, over Formosa. Ensign Thomas Lupo, flying an F6F from VF-11 aboard USS Hornet, was in a turning fight with a Kawanishi N-1K Shiden, one of Japan's newest and most capable fighters. The Japanese pilot was skilled and aggressive, repeatedly attempting to get inside Lupo's turn radius. Lupo maintained his tactical discipline, refusing to get drawn into a slow-speed turning fight where the lighter Japanese fighter might have an advantage. The Shiden pilot, perhaps frustrated by his inability to get a clean shot, took a desperate gamble. He rolled inverted and pulled through, attempting a high-deflection snapshot as Lupo passed through his sights. The Japanese pilot's 20mm cannons fired a short burst. 4 shells struck Lupo's Hellcat. The first hit the right-wing root, causing structural damage but missing the fuel tank and control runs. The second struck the engine cowling, penetrating the cowling but deflecting off the armoured engine of components. The third hit the cockpit area directly behind Lupo's head. This shell struck the armoured seat back at near-perfect perpendicular angle. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a fatal hit. The 20mm shell had enough energy to penetrate most aircraft structures, but the face-hardened armour plate behind Lupo's seat was specifically designed to defeat this threat. The shell deformed upon impact, its energy absorbed by the hardened steel. It failed to penetrate. The force of the impact threw Lupo forward against his shoulder harness hard enough to bruise, but the shell itself did not reach him. The fourth shell struck the fuselage spine just aft of the cockpit, causing damage but missing any critical systems. Lupo felt the impacts as sharp jolts through the aircraft. He instinctively checked his instruments. Oil pressure, normal. Engine temperature, slightly elevated but within limits. Control response, normal, though the stick felt slightly heavier, probably from wing damage. He was still flying. More importantly, he was not wounded. He radioed his wingman that he had taken hits but was still combat effective. The Shiden pilot, having expended his ammunition in that desperate burst, dove away and escaped. Lupo made the decision to disengage and return to the carrier. The flight back took 40 minutes. The damaged Hellcat flew with slightly degraded performance, the wing damage causing increased drag, but it remained controllable. Lupo made a successful arrested landing, and only then did he realize how close he had come to death. The maintenance crew showed him the armor plate from behind his seat. The crater where the 20mm shell had struck was clearly visible, deep but not penetrating. The chief aviation machinist mate explained what would have happened without that armor. The shell would have continued through the seat back, through Lupo's body, and exited through the instrument panel. The wound would have been instantly fatal. Instead, Lupo walked away without injury. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service 5 days later. The armor plate was left in place, the crater a permanent testament to the protection it had provided. Stories like Lupo's circulated throughout the fleet. Pilots knew that their aircraft could take hits and keep flying. They knew that armor worked. This knowledge affected their tactical decision-making in subtle but important ways. They were more willing to press attacks even when taking fire, knowing that hits that would have been fatal in earlier aircraft might now be survivable. They were less likely to panic when hit, maintaining their composure and continuing to fight. The psychological advantage this provided was difficult to quantify, but undeniably real. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots were drawing the opposite conclusion from their combat experiences. Their 20mm cannons, once feared as devastating weapons, were no longer producing reliable kills against American fighters. Their 7.7mm machine guns were even less effective, often making no impression at all on armoured Hellcats. The only reliable way to destroy a Hellcat was to maintain concentrated fire until the aircraft's protection was overwhelmed, or to achieve hits on unprotected areas, like the fuel tanks between the armour plates or the control surfaces. Both requirements meant staying in firing position longer, exposing the Japanese aircraft to return fire. The Zero's lack of protection meant that return fire from the Hellcat's 650 caliber guns was usually fatal. Late 1944 intelligence summaries from captured Japanese documents and prisoner interrogations revealed the demoralization spreading through Japanese naval aviation units. Pilots reported feeling helpless against American fighters that seemed immune to damage. Some described a fatalistic acceptance that combat against Hellcats was likely to be fatal regardless of their skill or tactics. The psychological collapse was as important as the physical imbalance in aircraft performance. The Japanese doctrine regarding armour and protection had made sense in 1941 when they enjoyed advantages in pilot training and tactical experience that allowed them to avoid taking hits. But by 1944, those advantages had evaporated. American pilots were now as well trained as their Japanese counterparts, often with more flight hours before entering combat. The industrial balance had shifted decisively. America was producing thousands of aircraft monthly, while Japan struggled to maintain production in the face of strategic bombing and resource shortages. The tactical balance had shifted as American doctrine evolved to counter Japanese strengths, and the technological balance had shifted as American fighters incorporated protection that Japanese fighters lacked. The Zero's design, optimized for the conditions of 1941, was profoundly ill-suited for the conditions of 1944 and 1945. The decision not to incorporate armour protection, which had seemed logical when the aircraft was designed, had become a fatal weakness. Japan attempted to address this problem, but the solutions came too late and in insufficient numbers. The A6M5 variant of the Zero, introduced in late 1944, incorporated some armour protection for the pilot and partially self-sealing fuel tanks, but the weight penalty degraded the aircraft's performance. The 05C was slower and climbed less effectively than earlier variants. It retained the tight turning radius that had always been the Zero's signature characteristic, but in an era where American pilots refused to engage in turning fights, this advantage was largely irrelevant. More importantly, the 05C was not produced in sufficient numbers to re-equip Japanese fighter squadrons. Most units continued flying earlier, unprotected variants throughout the war. The J-2M Raiden and N-1K Shiden fighters offered better protection and performance, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. By early 1945, the air war over the Pacific had become a slaughter. American carrier task forces operated with near impunity. Hellcat squadrons destroyed Japanese aircraft in lopsided engagements that made the early War Zero dominance seem like ancient history. The combat loss ratios told a story of absolute American supremacy. For every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat, approximately 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Part of this ratio reflected American numerical superiority and better tactics, but a significant portion reflected the simple fact that Hellcats could absorb battle damage and continue fighting while Japanese fighters could not. An engagement that ended with both aircraft scoring hits would typically see the Hellcat returning to base for repairs while the Japanese fighter went down in flames. Asymmetry in protection had created an asymmetry in combat outcomes that Japan could not overcome. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945 demonstrated this asymmetry. Japanese fighters from the home islands attempted to attack American forces invading the island. Hellcat squadrons from multiple carriers intercepted them. The Japanese formations included some of the newest fighters available, including Shiden and Raiden interceptors. The American formations consisted primarily of Hellcats, some of which were piloted by relatively inexperienced aviators fresh from training. The results were predictable. American fighters destroyed 63 Japanese aircraft over the course of the campaign for the loss of 11 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. Many of the lost Hellcats were hit by ground fire during strafing runs rather than destroyed by Japanese fighters. The 6-to-1 kill ratio understated the actual imbalance because it did not account for damaged aircraft that returned to base. Japanese pilots reported scoring hits on American fighters that seemed to have no effect. Multiple Hellcats returned from missions with battle damage from 20mm shells but remained flyable. One pilot from VF-87 took 7 hits from various Japanese weapons, including at least 2 20mm shells, but successfully landed aboard USS Ticonderoga. The aircraft was repaired and flew again the next day. The pilot was uninjured. By April 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, Japanese aviation had essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Most remaining aircraft were expended in kamikaze attacks, a tacit admission that conventional aerial combat was no longer winnable. The few Japanese fighters that attempted to engage American Hellcats and Corsairs in traditional air-to-air combat were quickly destroyed. The asymmetry in protection, combined with all the other American advantages, had made aerial combat over the Pacific effectively uncontested. The statistical record compiled by the United States Navy during and after World War II provides comprehensive documentation of the Hellcats' protective features and their combat effectiveness. Between August 1943 and August 1945, F6F Hellcats flew 270,000 combat sorties in the Pacific Theater. During those sorties, 6,432 Hellcats were lost to all causes. Of those losses, only 270 were attributed to air-to-air combat with enemy fighters. This represented a loss rate of approximately 0.1% per sortie in air-to-air combat. By comparison, the F4F Wildcat, which lacked many of the Hellcat's protective features, had suffered air-to-air combat losses at nearly double that rate during its service. The difference was directly attributable to survivability. Wildcats that took hits often went down. Hellcats that took hits often came home. Battle damage. Reports filed by carrier air groups provide specific documentation of this survivability. During operations off the Philippines in October and November 1944, VF-18, operating from USS Intrepid, reported that 23 of their Hellcats sustained battle damage severe enough to require more than superficial repairs. Of those 23 aircraft, 18 returned to operational status within 1 week. The remaining 5 required more extensive repairs, but were eventually restored to service. Not a single pilot was killed as a result of the battle damage sustained. The squadron's combat log noted that several of the damaged aircraft had taken hits in areas protected by armor. In each case, the armor had prevented what would have been fatal or mission-killing damage. One pilot's seat-back armor had stopped a 20mm shell. Another aircraft's engine armor had deflected multiple machine gun rounds away from critical engine components. A third had taken a hit in the oil cooler area, but the armored protection around the cooler had prevented immediate oil loss, allowing the pilot to return to the carrier before the engine seized. Similar reports came from squadrons across the fleet. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. Hellcats were surviving battle damage at rates far exceeding earlier American fighters and completely surpassing Japanese aircraft. The Bureau of Aeronautics compiled this data into comprehensive assessments that validated every design decision Grumman had made regarding armor protection. The weight penalty was justified. The performance trade-offs were acceptable. The protection worked. But the numbers only told part of the story. The human dimension was equally important. Pilots who survived hits that should have killed them became fierce advocates for the Hellcat. They wrote letters home describing how the aircraft had saved their lives. They spoke to replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific, telling them that the Hellcat would bring them home if they flew it properly. This word-of-mouth testimony was as valuable as any official report in building pilot confidence. Lieutenant James Sweat, who would finish the war as an ace with 15 and a half confirmed victories, described the moment he fully understood the Hellcat's protective capabilities. During an engagement over Rabaul in January 1944, his aircraft took a 20mm hit in the cockpit area while he was pursuing a Japanese bomber. He felt the impact through the airframe and instinctively checked himself for wounds. There were none. After landing, he examined the armor plate behind his seat and found the impact point. The shell had struck at an angle, but the hardened steel had defeated the penetration attempt. Sweat later said that moment changed his entire approach to combat. He knew intellectually that the Hellcat had armor, but seeing physical proof that the armor had just saved his life gave him confidence that allowed him to fight more aggressively. He trusted the aircraft to protect him, and that trust made him a more effective fighter pilot. This psychological effect multiplied across thousands of aviators. Young pilots arriving in the Pacific with minimal combat experience drew confidence from the Hellcat's reputation for survivability. They knew that mistakes might result in taking hits, but hits did not necessarily mean death. This reduced the paralyzing fear that could cause pilots to hesitate in combat. They could focus on executing their tactics rather than worrying about immediate survival. The Japanese experience was precisely opposite. As pilot survival rates declined and combat losses mounted, fear became pervasive. Japanese aviators went into combat knowing that any hit had a high probability of being fatal. The Zero's lack of protection meant there was no margin for error. This created a psychological burden that affected performance. Pilots flew defensively, prioritizing survival over aggressive tactics. When they did engage, desperation sometimes led to poor decisions. By mid-1945, interrogations of captured Japanese pilots revealed the depth of this demoralization. Multiple prisoners expressed variations of the same sentiment. Fighting American aircraft had become hopeless. The Americans had planes that would not burn, that would not go down even when hit repeatedly. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots flew aircraft that would explode from a single burst of fire. The imbalance was so severe that some pilots admitted they had considered ramming attacks not out of dedication to Bushido philosophy, but because conventional gunnery seemed futile. This was the ultimate vindication of the American design philosophy. The decision to prioritize protection over pure performance had not just saved individual pilots, it had created a psychological advantage that magnified every other American superiority. Better training, superior tactics, overwhelming numbers, and technological advancement were all amplified by the simple fact that American pilots believed they could survive combat, while Japanese pilots increasingly believed they could not. The long-term impact of the Hellcat's protective features extended beyond World War II. Post-war aircraft design incorporated the lessons learned from the F6F's combat performance. The principle that pilot survival justified performance trade-offs became foundational to American military aviation. Subsequent fighters like the F8F Bearcat, though designed for maximum performance, still incorporated substantial armor protection. The early jets of the 1950s, despite their revolutionary propulsion systems, retained armored cockpits and protected fuel systems. The Korean War validated these design choices again. American pilots flying F9F Panthers and other jets discovered that armor protection remained relevant even at jet speeds. Ground fire and enemy cannon fire could still be survived if the aircraft was properly protected. Soviet-designed MiG-15 fighters, which prioritized performance over protection in ways reminiscent of the Zero, proved vulnerable to battle damage. American pilots reported that MiGs that took hits often went down, while American fighters absorbed similar damage and continued fighting. The Vietnam War continued the pattern. 4 Phantom pilots relied on their aircraft's redundant systems and protected components to survive hits from anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles. The Aoni Sky Raider, a propeller-driven attack aircraft that seemed obsolete in the jet age, earned legendary status, partly because its robust construction and protected systems allowed it to absorb tremendous punishment and still bring pilots home. Even modern fighters incorporate the philosophy that originated with aircraft like the Hellcat. The F-16, 15, and F-18 all feature armored cockpits, redundant flight control systems, and protected fuel tanks. These features add weight and complexity, but they are considered non-negotiable because the lesson learned over the Pacific in 1944 and 1945 has never been forgotten. A trained pilot is more valuable than any aircraft, and protecting that pilot justifies almost any design trade-off. The technical specifications of the Hellcat's armor system became the baseline for future designs. The face-hardened steel armor plate used in the F6F became the standard material for aircraft armor protection. The thickness and placement were studied and optimized. The 3/8-inch plate behind the pilot's seat became a common specification, repeated in subsequent designs with variations based on specific threat assessments. Self-sealing fuel tank technology evolved directly from the systems used in the Hellcat. The multiple-layer rubber compound design was refined and improved, but the basic principle remained unchanged. Modern military aircraft use descendants of the same technology, now enhanced with foam baffles and fire suppression systems, but still relying on the fundamental concept of swelling material that seals bullet holes. The bulletproof windscreen technology also evolved from World War II designs. Modern fighter canopies use advanced polycarbonate materials instead of laminated glass, but they serve the same function: protect the pilot's vision while stopping small arms fire and fragments. The engineering challenges of creating transparent armor were first systematically addressed in aircraft like the Hellcat, and the solutions developed then informed every subsequent design. Perhaps most significantly, the Hellcat's combat record proved that survivability features must be integrated into the basic design rather than added as afterthoughts. Attempts to retrofit armor onto aircraft not designed to carry it typically failed. The weight and balance changes degraded performance to unacceptable levels. But the Hellcat had been designed from start to incorporate protection, so the systems were optimized and integrated into the overall airframe design. This lesson shaped post-war procurement requirements. When the military specified performance requirements for new aircraft, survivability features were included in the initial requirements rather than being considered optional extras. Designers were required to demonstrate how pilot protection would be achieved within the performance envelope. This ensured that survivability received equal consideration with speed, range, and firepower during the design process. The men who flew Hellcats in combat carried the memory of the aircraft's protection with them for the rest of their lives. Reunions of Hellcat pilots often featured discussions of close calls and miraculous survivals. Veterans would share stories of taking hits that should have been fatal, but walking away uninjured. They would show photographs of their damaged aircraft, pointing out where armor had stopped rounds or where self-sealing tanks had prevented fires. These stories were told with a reverence that went beyond simple nostalgia. The pilots understood, perhaps better than anyone else, the significance of the design choices Grumman had made. They had bet their lives on those choices, and survived because the choices were correct. Many veterans explicitly credited the Hellcat's armor with saving their lives. Some kept pieces of armor plate from their aircraft as personal mementos, physical reminders of the protection that had stood between them and death. David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed victories, spoke frequently in later years about the Hellcat's survivability. He emphasized that his high score was achieved not just through aggressive tactics, but through the confidence that his aircraft would protect him when he took risks. He described taking hits during several engagements and being able to continue fighting because the Hellcat absorbed the damage. Without that capability, he said, his career would have been much shorter and his score much lower. The legacy of the Hellcat's armor protection extends into contemporary military thinking about air combat. Modern air forces recognize that survivability in combat requires multiple layers of protection: avoiding detection through stealth technology, avoiding engagement through superior sensors and long-range weapons, avoiding hits through maneuverability and electronic countermeasures, and surviving hits through physical protection of critical systems and crew. This multi-layered approach to survivability traces directly back to the lessons learned from comparing the Hellcat's philosophy with the Zero's philosophy. The Zero relied almost entirely on not being hit. This worked when Japanese pilots had superior training and tactics, but it failed catastrophically when those advantages evaporated. The Hellcat's designers understood that being hit was inevitable in combat, so they designed the aircraft to survive hits. This proved to be the more robust approach. The comparison between these two design philosophies has been studied extensively in military engineering courses and defense acquisition programs. The Zero is often cited as an example of over-optimization, where pursuit of maximum performance in certain parameters created fatal weaknesses in others. The Hellcat is cited as an example of balanced design, where performance in multiple parameters was optimized simultaneously to create an aircraft with no critical weaknesses. Modern systems engineering applies these lessons broadly. Whether designing aircraft, ground vehicles, ships, or any other military system, the principle holds. Survivability must be designed into the system from the beginning. Protection cannot be an afterthought. The additional weight, complexity, and cost of protective features are justified by the reduction in casualties and the increase in mission effectiveness. The final measure of the Hellcat's armor protection came in the decades after World War II, as historians and analysts compiled comprehensive data on the Pacific Air War. The statistics confirmed what participants had known. The F6F Hellcat achieved the most favorable kill-to-loss ratio of any American fighter in the war, and survivability features were a major factor in that success. The approximately 19-to-1 kill ratio reflected multiple factors: superior tactics, better training, numerical superiority, and the Hellcat's performance advantages all contributed. But battle damage analysis showed that a significant portion of the ratio came from asymmetric survivability. Engagements where both sides scored hits typically ended with the Hellcat surviving and the Japanese fighter being destroyed. This asymmetry, repeated across thousands of engagements, accumulated into the devastating statistics that defined the Pacific Air War's final phase. Japanese historians and military analysts studying the war reached similar conclusions. The technical research conducted by Japan's post-war self-defense forces identified the Zero's lack of protection as one of the critical factors in Japan's defeat. Combined with inadequate pilot training, insufficient numbers, and inferior tactics by late war, the vulnerability of Japanese aircraft made aerial combat increasingly one-sided. Some Japanese analysts went further, arguing that the decision not to incorporate armor protection into the Zero represented a fundamental strategic error. The weight penalties and performance reductions that would have resulted from adding protection would have been more than compensated for by increased pilot survival rates. A protected Zero that was slightly slower would have been more valuable than an unprotected Zero that was slightly faster, because the protected version would have allowed experienced pilots to survive longer and accumulate more combat effectiveness. This analysis, conducted with decades of hindsight, validated the American approach. Grumman's engineers had made the correct choice. The weight penalty for armor was worth accepting. The performance trade-offs were justified. The result was an aircraft that not only defeated its opponents in combat, but did so while bringing its pilots home safely at unprecedented rates. The story of how Japanese pilots encountered the Hellcat's armor and realized their weapons were no longer effective is not a story of a single technological feature determining the outcome of the war. It is a story of how design philosophy reflects broader strategic thinking, and how correct philosophy, consistently applied, creates advantages that compound over time. The Hellcat's armor was one piece of a comprehensive American approach to naval aviation that emphasized sustainability, survivability, and systematic improvement. But it was a crucial piece. The psychological impact of armor that worked, of protection that saved lives, of aircraft that brought pilots home, cannot be quantified in spreadsheets or captured in statistics. It existed in the confidence of American pilots and the despair of their Japanese opponents. It shaped tactical decisions in ways that affected combat outcomes, and it ensured that America's growing advantages in training, tactics, and technology were not squandered through unnecessary pilot casualties. The young Japanese pilot who discovered that his 20mm shells were no longer achieving reliable kills against American fighters was witnessing the culmination of design choices made years earlier in a factory on Long Island. He could not have known the engineering details or the strategic reasoning behind those choices. He only knew that the enemy aircraft he was fighting had become nearly impossible to destroy with the weapons he carried, while his own aircraft remained fatally vulnerable to return fire. That asymmetry, multiplied across the thousands of engagements that comprised the Pacific Air War, meant that American victory was not just probable but inevitable. The Hellcat's armor was not the only factor, but it was an essential factor. It transformed what might have been costly battles into one-sided victories. It allowed aggressive tactics without prohibitive casualties, and it ensured that America's industrial and technological advantages translated directly into combat superiority. The 3/8-inch plate of face-hardened steel behind the pilot's seat, the bulletproof windscreen, the self-sealing fuel tanks. These were not glamorous features. They did not make the Hellcat faster or more maneuverable. They did not show up in propaganda photographs or newsreel footage. But they were the features that won the war. One saved pilot at a time, one survived hit at a time, one engagement at a time, until Japanese aviation was crushed, and the skies over the Pacific belonged entirely to America. That is the legacy of the Hellcat's armor. Not just that it worked, but that it represented a philosophy of warfare that valued the soldier as much as the weapon, that recognized training and experience as strategic resources to be protected, and that understood victory comes not just from defeating the enemy, but from ensuring your own forces survive to fight again. These principles, forged in the crucible of the Pacific War and validated by the Hellcat's combat record, remain fundamental to American military thinking 8 decades later. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.